Hey guys, it's Mrs. Olenichuk, and today we're going to talk about natural selection. Before we get into natural selection, we should probably define evolution. So evolution is just a change in a population over time. A lot of times people confuse evolution and natural selection. So natural selection is just one of the ways that these changes can happen. Evolution is a thing, and natural selection is one of the ways that that thing can occur. So a change in a population over time is the definition of evolution. If you want to add in some of the genetics terms that we've covered, you can also think of it as the change in the allele frequency of a population or gene pool over time. So essentially you have an increase in the frequency of a particular allele or version of a gene. And if that frequency of the allele changes over time, either becomes greater or less, then we call that evolution. To calculate allele frequency, you just look at the number of alleles for a particular trait, say for dark hair, over the total number of alleles for hair color in a population. Like I said, natural selection, one of the ways that that can happen, essentially it just says that some factor in the environment selects individuals who are better suited to survive, those guys reproduce, and they change the population over time because they pass their alleles on to the next generation, and the more individuals with a particular allele that reproduce and pass it on, the greater the frequency of that allele. Now there's other mechanisms that can cause evolution. Mutation has a big role in evolution, migration, and even things like genetic drift, which can be totally random, can cause those changes. So natural selection is just one of the ways that this can happen. So Charles Darwin came up with this idea of evolution by natural selection, so the theory of evolution by natural selection. And some of the factors or ideas that are part of it are overproduction, variation, competition, adaptation, differential reproductive success, and in the end you have an evolution of a population. So we're going to go through what each of these terms means and how they kind of apply to natural selection, and we're going to use the moth as an example. So you can imagine that there's an environment that can either be really light, like you see here, or a little bit darker. And so there's moths that live in this environment that have light-colored wings, which helps them camouflage. During the Industrial Revolution, these particular trees were covered with soot, and so you had a darker pigmentation here, which meant that lighter moths were no longer really well suited to the environment. So it's kind of a classic example of evolution by natural selection. So overproduction of offspring just means that organisms tend to produce more offspring than can survive. Basically, they make lots of babies. Not all of those babies can survive to adulthood, and so you're going to have competition for resources. Those babies, those offspring, are all going to have some level of variation. And it has to be an inherited variation for natural selection to really kick in. So we look and we say that offspring are born with different traits or phenotypes because they have different combinations of alleles in their genes. Those differences are the result of things like mutation, crossing over, independent assortment. Remember we were talking about how you get variation in a population, and these are the ways that that variation can occur. So here you look at your moths, you have your lighter colored phenotype and your darker colored phenotype. That's just one type of variation that occurred in those populations. So you've had lots of babies born, and each of them is slightly different. They have some different phenotypes that are the result of mutation, crossing over, and independent assortment. Now, because There's more babies born than the environment can support. You have a competition to survive, and that's because there's a limited number of resources. So things like food, shelter, mates, water, avoiding being eaten, sunlight, particularly if you're a plant, and oxygen, along with other factors, can cause this competition among offspring. So in our moth example, you had a lot of baby moths born. Some were light, some were dark. They didn't want to be eaten. And so those individuals that were better able to camouflage were less likely to be eaten. And so we say that they had an adaptation. So an adaptation is basically a trait that allows individuals to survive. Variation is random, and so an individual can't choose to have an adaptation. You're either born with it or you're not. And remember, an advantage in one environment could be a disadvantage in another. So before the Industrial Revolution and now after we no longer use as many coal-fired power plants, moths that were light had an adaptation because the trees were light. However, when the environment changed, those moths were no longer adapted to the environment, and so those with the darker coloration were better able to survive, and so their phenotype became an adaptation. You can't decide what you're going to have. You can't choose to have an adaptation. You're going to be born with it or not. Reproduction, just differential reproductive success, essentially says that those individuals who are better suited to the environment will survive and reproduce most successfully. This is survival of the fittest. If you reproduce more, you leave behind more offspring, and so the trait that you carry is more likely to be passed on. Basically, if you leave behind more offspring, you kind of win the game of natural selection. You can see in the diagram in generation 1, when the trees were lighter, there was a higher frequency of the light-colored allele in the population. However, as the lighter color moths were killed off, you had more and more dark moths surviving and reproducing and leaving behind offspring that had that dark coloration. And so, again, in generation 3, more and more of the dark moths are reproducing and leaving behind those alleles. As a result, you have an increase in the alleles or the traits that are beneficial in an environment. So over time, traits that result in more offspring accumulate in the environment and the population is better suited. It's good to remember that natural selection and evolution applies to populations, not individuals. So an individual can't evolve. A population evolves over time. Just like an individual can't choose to have an adaptation, it can't change to suit the environment, the population, if they have variation that allows them to survive, will change over time. So in our moth example, that's what we call industrial melanism. And there's other factors that are kind of involved in this. But basically it says as the environment became darker, you saw an increase in the frequency of dark-colored moths. Now, as pollution levels are low and you have a higher frequency of light-colored trees in the environment, they actually are seeing lighter-colored moths increasing in the environment. And so environments change, and so allele frequencies change. Hopefully, because if they don't, then you die out. So if that was confusing, I like to use the zombie apocalypse example to kind of explain this. And this applies to antibiotic resistance, which is another example of evolution by natural selection that we've been able to see in real time. So imagine the zombie apocalypse happens. The population of our class, some individuals are just going to have the mutation that allows them to be immune to the zombie bug. You don't know if you have it, you can't tell, it doesn't offer any advantage until the zombies come. Those individuals who are immune to the zombies will survive. The rest of us, we become zombies. But once those individuals who survive the zombies have offspring who also have the trait or the allele that allows them to survive the zombies, the number of individuals or humans who are resistant to the zombie virus or bug will increase in the population. And sooner or later, we'll have a population of humans who are all immune to zombies. Now, whether or not you had the variation that allowed you to survive zombies was completely random and didn't offer an advantage until the zombies showed up. But over time, populations who were resistant would increase. And so that's natural selection. We've seen the same kind of idea happen with antibiotic resistance. So bacteria who are resistant to antibiotic through some genetic mutation will survive and reproduce. They reproduce asexually, so all of their offspring will have that trait. And so we've seen an increase in populations that are resistant to the antibiotics we use. Here's another diagram that may help you understand. So there's a population of bacteria. A few of them are going to be resistant to a particular antibiotic. Normally, they don't have much of an advantage because that antibiotic isn't around. But once you start taking antibiotics, you kill off the susceptible bacteria, leaving behind the resistant ones. Now, they don't have any competition because you've killed everybody else. They will reproduce. And so the next time you take an antibiotic or that same antibiotic, you'll have a population that's resistant. Bacteria can even transfer that resistance to other bacteria, which can also cause problems. This antibiotic resistance is a really big problem, especially when individuals take antibiotics when they don't need them or don't finish their round of antibiotics. When we talk about evolution, it's good to think about this idea of descent with modification. Now, descent with modification doesn't mean that one species necessarily turns into another. It just means that the species that are around now descended from species that existed before them. Every generation, there's going to be slight differences in the offspring from the parents. And over time, those differences are going to accumulate. And this is over many, many generations that you see this change. You can also look at the idea that we've all descended from a common ancestor. This doesn't mean that we are a bacteria. It just means that we share an ancestor with bacteria. And we'll talk more about this in class. The last thing I kind of want you to do, and you'll do this in class, is to make a cartoon or a foldable showing overproduction, variation, competition, differential survival, and reproduction in kind of a foldable form. So you can choose any organism you'd like. It could be made up or it could be real. And try to show how these factors could contribute to an increase in favorable alleles in the population. Here are some pictures, some ideas that may help you look for organisms. Remember, plants are also a great example of species that have evolved through natural selection. And I look forward to seeing your cartoons. Bye.